what I'm here to talk today about is Conway's Law, which some of you may have heard of. I'm aiming to give a brief introduction to it and some guidance on where to learn more if you're so interested. What you can see on the screen here is a picture taken, I think it was in the first half of the 1900s, in a factory in somewhere in, I can't find out exactly where, but northern England somewhere. And there's some interesting points to point out here, and this is the context in which Conway's Law was, it was not only thought about in this context, but this was where one of the aspects of it came from. So you see here we've got a factory floor of some kind, conveyor belt running down the middle. We've got people working on either side of that conveyor belt. And if you look closely, you can see that some of them are doing quite similar roles to each other, and you've got people further down the conveyor belt doing different roles. And so we've got an element of specialization within the teams here. And we've got I imagine they're managers, the people standing in the background appearing to be waiting around for something to happen, perhaps wearing a tie. And this is the kind of environment in which systems were originally thought of before technology came along and computers specifically. So this is where Melvin Conway first had the ideas about writing a paper that would describe what later has become known as Conway's Law. And so Conway's Law is described in the paper, at least, is described as any organization that designs a system that will produce a design whose structure is a copy of the organization's communication structure. So this is a fairly meaty sentence, I must say. But if I was to summarize it in modern language, I guess, you could summarize it as, if you were to design an organization structure, the hierarchy of it to be a certain way, you will find that your communication structure, your communications network, I should say, is informed by that hierarchy, which will then inform how your teams build their systems or build their products, which is a little bit counterintuitive when you first think about it. But as we go through, hopefully I'll be able to explain it and convince you of it. So what exactly is meant by a communications network? We might take this example here of a fairly simplistic organizational hierarchy. And you've obviously got the CEO or the president at the top, and there's various people reporting into him or her, and then teams underneath that. And so the black lines here are representing two people who are talking to each other, be it professionally or socially or for some other purpose. And we can see that there are people who are very popular. There's a guy or woman in the middle here who's obviously giving out chocolate or beer or something because he or she is very popular and everyone's talking to him or her. Or maybe he or she is just a senior person in the team and happens to know lots about the system and lots about the environment they're working in. And so these black lines are the communications hierarchy or the communications network within the company. And if you think about it for a minute, there's often one or two people in a company who have undue influence over a company's way of working because of their social networks within the company or communications networks. There's often people like this who are the informal center of the company. If you think of a company as a sort of a web of connections. And so this person will have an undue influence over the way the software is built and the hierarchy or the architecture of that software in our case. So this is all very good. What can we practically do with it? What can we use this information or this theory for? So let's imagine for a moment that we have a desire to reverse engineer a team structure from a system structure, from a system architecture. So if we were to have an organizational hierarchy that looks like this, we've got in the blue we've got some front-end teams, in the green we've got some back-end teams, and they all work with a centralized database and following on to that an ops team. And so if we arrange our teams in this way, we'll inevitably end up with a structure that looks like this in our system hierarchy. So we'll have 4 separate applications and a core database. So really there's this, the way that the team structured it will actually lead to the way the systems are structured, so you can actually reverse engineer it as well and structure your teams in a way that reflects or enhances or maybe evolves your system architecture, if that makes sense. So if you zoom out from this and you start thinking about not just teams or teams of teams, but organization-wide, there's some interesting correlations between not just inside an organization, but also outside an organization. And so what I'm trying to show in this diagram is that if you look at the very left of the diagram, you've got the environment, you've got some external factors which are playing on or influencing the company. You've got your leaders who are ideally architecting the way that the company is going forward, not just in strategy, but also in the way that the organization is structured. And so there's a question about whether the strategy fits with the internal parts of the organization, which you could broadly summarize as being made up of the formal structure, the people involved, and then the culture of that organization or of those teams, and then what are the critical activities that those people do. And so if you can align the internal workings of that organization with the strategy, and ideally the leaders would have thought of this before deciding on the strategy, that's when that will lead to your performance or good performance or poor performance coming out the other end. So it's a matter of taking the environment, building a strategy that leverages that environment or leverages the opportunities in that environment, aligns with the organization's internal workings, or maybe changes the internal workings to align with the strategy to a certain extent, and that will lead out to the performance at the other end. There's a lot of humorous diagrams about organization structure, and I'm sure you've probably seen some of these before. And if you start looking at these, you can start to think that a company's culture, at least even from an outsider's perspective, is, you can appreciate why these comical diagrams of the organization structure might make sense. If you think of Microsoft, for example, before Satya Nadella became CEO a number of years ago, they were run as there was a lot of internal competition and internal fighting, and the culture that culture leads to this kind of organizational diagram that you see here, where they're effectively pointing guns at each other internally. And so they're more concerned with fighting each other to win, rather than meeting customer needs or competitive, battling with competitors. So there's a couple of different pieces there. I think for me the Microsoft one was the funniest one, but it's really just trying to reflect that the culture of a company is known to the people outside the company, and that is intrinsically linked with the organization structure. So there's an example here taken from GitHub. I'm sure you're all familiar with GitHub. When they first started and they were setting up the company, they designed the principle. They were trying to design it around open source principles, and so they were trying to think of, if we work in a certain way, we will be better placed to serve our customers. And back in the beginning, they were serving open source projects. Well, that was their guiding principle anyway. And so they were obviously focused on electronic communication, being available and being transparent about what work was being done. They were focused on asynchronous communication and asynchronous work rather than synchronous. And then lastly, if you've ever been a developer and you understand the context of a lock, they were trying to avoid locks and make it possible for people to work independently without causing conflicts with each other. And of course, the biggest principle that was quite novel at the time was that they were working on the basis that people were distributed. So their company itself was self-distributed, and and that came in from the principles, the open source principles, through to the organization design, and then through the systems and way that they would interact with their customers. So I've got a couple of books here that are good for some more in-depth knowledge. I've referenced a couple of the pictures out of the Team Topology book here, which you may or may not have heard about. It only came out fairly recently, and it goes into more detail about the different team structures, or the generic team structures that you can use and how they interact with each other. But it really plays on the idea that if you structure your teams in a certain way, you'll end up with a certain communications network within your company, and therefore end up with a sort of implied system architecture or product architecture. And then dynamic reteaming is a related but slightly different angle, where we're really looking at how we can evolve our teams, not just through coaching, but perhaps restructuring and changing the ways the teams are interacting with each other as well. And that is it from me.
All right. Should we give Damien a hand?
I hope so.
Thanks, Damien.
So I've not seen any questions in the chat. So if you have any questions on Conway's Law, now would be the time.
Thanks for the talk. Just a really quick observation on my part is this has somehow just helped me to even better understand the difference between Encarta and Wikipedia in terms of the structures in Microsoft versus the structures at Wikipedia. Yeah. It's quite interesting.
It's fascinating, isn't it? Because the way that company, Wikipedia in particular, was organized, it had to be in line with the way that they wanted their product to work, or their offering. If they had structured themselves the way that Encarta did, having all the experts in-house, they never would have been able to build the Wikipedia the way that they have. So I find it fascinating. There's lots of examples of relationships between what it seems to be fairly arbitrary and unrelated in terms of the way a company is structured and the products that they build, because it seems irrelevant the way the company is structured and would have no impact on the product, but it really does. There's lots of examples where it happens that way. I suppose it's just the way the company's culture evolves, isn't it? Any other questions for me at the moment? I suppose Conway's Law is pretty straightforward, hopefully.
Hi, thanks a million. It's been really interesting. And I think I've come across it before, but you've really kind of made it make sense. I was wondering, how have you used this concept as part of your coaching career to influence change?
Well, in my experience as a coach, one of the questions that will come up every 6 months or a year is, should we restructure the teams? And should we think about moving responsibilities around to meet some organizational goal or from some other reason? And Conway's Law is one of the principles that I've used to sort of guide those conversations and lead to trying to predict how certain organization structures will benefit or disadvantage us. So one concrete example is where the company I used to work for, we would look at where someone had the brilliant idea of moving to the Spotify model, or a version that they had read about somewhere on the internet, and I used this information in team topologies to really explain to them the relationship between org structure and system architecture and the converse, and explain that if we wanted to have a system architecture a certain way, and we designed our org structure in a completely incoherent or inconsistent way, we're unlikely to get the outcome that we're after. And we ran experiments with not experiments, I suppose it was thought exercises, where we looked at different org structures and tried to figure out independently what we thought the system architectural result would be. And it was surprising how common we all came up with the same ideas, even though we worked independently. And so that was one way that I used it to try and convince people or convince teams or show teams that working in an org structure is not independent of everything else. It's heavily related to the way the culture of the teams work, as well as their the structure of their products. I suppose it was useful as a thought exercise and a way of getting people to think about what they were asking for in more complex and nuanced ways than just thinking, oh, I want to move so and so over there. Does that help?
Yeah, I think it's just someone's like this, you know, everyone keeps throwing out the Spotify model all the time, and I think it's a good way of, you know, asking leadership to not jump on the latest bandwagon whenever the new Spotify come on and you're like, oh, this is how we're going to make everything. So thank you very much. I think it's food for thought.
Okay, thank you.
What about if the communication that's happening is unnatural and forced by the hierarchies that are in place? How can you shine a light on that and maybe help people see?
Explain to me what you mean by unnatural. Do you mean like a social interaction, or do you mean it's some kind of, we're forcing these two people to talk to each other and they're going to like it, or what do you mean by that?
So specifically what I mean is, so for example, where a CEO might be talking to heads of to get their view on what's happening in the business.
Okay.
And that is potentially going wrong because they're not actually talking to the people on the ground who really know what's going on.
It's an interesting one, because it's a really common one too, because it's an element of people are making comments or providing updates about something that they perhaps aren't up to date on or aren't informed about.
Yeah.
I mean, the communication networks outside the teams themselves, and you're really referring to, I think, the management layer above the teams. Yeah. It doesn't really extend to them. So they were, you would see them as sort of separate from the team ecosystem, I suppose. But just to answer your question, the way that we can try and remedy that kind of situation is, there's probably lots of different ways of doing it. I often use the model where I ask the teams to produce their own view of what's happening and effectively share that information proactively. And that means that the people who are making getting the comments, and perhaps they're responding because they don't necessarily feel like they know how to get that information themselves. So if it was provided to them proactively, it can sort of avoid the problem of the managers giving the wrong or out of date information, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. It's aligned with what Elaine was talking about earlier. By having this information regularly and collected and provided, it does give some insight. And if someone's too busy or whatever reason they're not asking the necessary questions, by giving that information to them proactively, it can at least start to stop that the comments coming from the managers in an uninformed way. Does that help?
Well, it sort of does, but I think what I'm looking at is where I think potentially, like, sometimes hierarchies can get out of control. Like, companies grow, and because you're taking on new people, then the existing people get promoted, and so on and so on, and you end up with like a bloat of middle management, etc.
True.
Push my mouth, but you do. How can you then maybe use this to? Can you reflatten out that structure once that's happened, or is that not possible?
So the important part about what I think you're referring to is the communication network part of it. So how do you influence the communication network so that the information that's flowing across your organization is, the right information, but also up to date? And
yeah, so, going through sort of forced imposed funnels.
I always find that these things are quite complex, and by drawing them out, it's a good way of starting to simplify or at least get an understanding of what's going on. Because it's and then I always find it interesting when I show a diagram like that to somebody else. They'll go, oh, you know what? that person talks to him, they're always going for coffees, and you start to get more and more information about who's actually talking to who and where the information is actually flowing from. And that starts to inform how you can start to tackle these problems, by really just, potentially getting the right information in front of the right people. And it's maybe not obvious who that person is at times.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's a daunting task to do, but I think you're absolutely right. Plotting it out and trying to work out those lines of communication is probably the start, isn't it?
But it's a fascinating subject because the communication networks in companies are so weird sometimes, and the connections people have are just completely obscure and strange.
So true. Thank you.